So for the past 3 videos, we've been talking about autopoiesis, the richness and the power and empowerment of acknowledging ourselves as this self-creating process. But autopoiesis, for all its liberating qualities, has a dark side as well. And that is when we end up getting in our own ways, when we end up creating ourselves as something less than our potential, when we construct of ourselves a slave instead of a liberated sovereign. So in this video, we're going to look at some of the many ways in which we tend to participate in this self-disempowering pattern within our minds. So looking at all the ways in which we tend to disempower ourselves becomes quite interesting within the context of this idea of ourselves as autopoietic, self-constructing beings. Because if we agree that we are indeed self-constructing individuals, then the ways in which we get in our own way, the ways in which we end up basically deconstructing ourselves in certain ways becomes very, very interesting. Because the ways in which we undermine ourselves through self-inflicted disempowerment becomes part of this process, right? It becomes a decreation rather than a creation of ourselves. In short, we disempower ourselves constantly, and this is the dark shadow of the autopoietic process. Our participation in fashioning ourselves in the image of something that is not in accordance with our own best interests. And so why is this interesting and important? Well, it's interesting and important because if we want to grow, if we truly want to grow, the very first step we have to take is get out of our own way. We have to stop undermining ourselves. We have to stop participating in whatever is being done to us behind our backs. We have to stop giving away our power for free. Self-disempowerment is, for the autopoietic person, at once the most ordinary and normalized things, but also the epitome of absurdity. So let's reflect on this mechanism a little bit. Let's see if we can locate some of its hidden drivers and maybe come up with a sophisticated response to it. So we're living in a time in which I think it's fair to say that either we make our own choices or some forces will make our choices for us, in conspiracy with our insecure little ego, right? Forces will enslave us by carefully massaging our particular traumatic experiences in such a way that we willingly give up our power. Some of the main expressions of this is, of course, things like social media, turning us into clickers in the attention economy. It's capitalism turning us into mindless consumers through idiotic consumption of ridiculous plastic objects, turning us into fools of some capitalist structures that do not have our best interest at heart and from whose revenue stream we are disconnected. But it goes deeper than that. It encapsulates our adherence to cheap ideals into the idea of financial success, accumulation of status, external manifestations, which are all driven by envy and comparison. It manifests through things like ideology, which I would consider to be the ultimate collapse of the individual's sovereignty. To sell our souls to a set of ideas that we adopt instead of doing the work to arrive at our own volition. We disempower ourselves through conformity and based in this internal fear of what will others say, what will others think about me, will I have any friends tomorrow? We disempower ourselves through resistance to what is, which for most of us leads to a path of least resistance. We disempower ourselves through judgment of others, thus alienating not only them but ourselves. And we disempower ourselves through a fear of life, right? Through an inability to take risks in our lives, an inability to throw ourselves into basically the furnace of existence and see what it will make of us and what we will make of it, thus failing to heed the call to adventure because we're afraid of the transformative process that we inherently know that is going to be. And the main function of many of these mechanisms that I just mentioned is based in the idea of fooling us into giving up our power by making us forget that we possess it in the first place. But because we are in fact autopoietic beings, self-constructing individuals, the truth is that we participate in this self-disempowerment. And therefore it is the ultimate self-deletion to come afterwards and say, as some victim, oh, they made a consumer out of me and I didn't even know it was happening. This basically counts as the ultimate self-deletion, right? Because now, not only did they succeed in manipulating us to do this, we acknowledge that we had no power in it. And thus, if we had no power from the beginning, that is basically equivalent to saying that we don't exist. But the truth is, we participated voluntarily. We handed over the keys to our own liberation willingly. So let's venture a little bit deeper and reflect a little bit, right? Let's ask ourselves a question like, what are some of the ways in which I participate in my own self-disempowerment without really noticing? Once we start to get an understanding of the ways in which we disempower ourselves, we also enable ourselves to address it, right? Because we have now become conscious, and it allows us to ask certain interesting questions like, why am I allowing this to happen to me? And so we might ask ourselves, what might be a method for breaking this pattern and thus gaining more access to the positive version of our self-creation? How can we step out of this self-disempowerment circus and instead create ourselves in the image of our highest ideals? I would say step number one is to ask ourselves, am I in fact participating in this disempowerment of me, this reduction of me into an economical unit, into a clicker, into a user? Is there some kind of weird conspiracy going on between these forces and perhaps my little insecure ego? Step number two, if so, how am I participating in this? Step number three, why? Why am I participating in this undermining and subversion of my own personal autopoietic sovereignty? Now we could take this method way further and add a lot of extra points, but these are really the important ones. Can we acknowledge that we are being turned into a tool? Can we acknowledge that we participate in this process? And can we interest ourselves in how and why we are doing this? What is it within us that allows this to happen, that allows us to participate in the undermining of ourselves? Because the thing is, once we answer these questions, I bet